The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Copper Creek as Hannah Miller hurried along the dusty main street, keeping her head down and her sleeves firmly buttoned at the wrists, despite the sweltering June heat. 3 months in this frontier town, and she still felt the weight of curious stares following her. The townsfolk had been kind enough when Doc Wilson brought her in from that terrible night on the plains. But kindness didn't stop their whispers. Hannah clutched her basket of medical supplies closer to her chest, quickening her pace past the general store where Mrs. Abernathy stood sweeping, no doubt eager to engage in another round of probing questions about Hannah's past. The scars that crisscrossed her arms and throat felt especially tight today, as though the memories themselves were constricting around her like a noose. "Miss Miller, hold up there!" Sheriff Tom Parker's voice rang out behind her, and Hannah reluctantly slowed her steps. The lawman had been nothing but decent to her since her arrival, but his eyes always lingered a moment too long on the thin, raised line that ran from below her ear down into the high collar she wore even on the hottest days. "Doc's looking for you. Says he needs those bandages straight away. Got a situation up at the Marshall place." Hannah nodded, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat to better shield her face. "I was just heading that way, Sheriff. Is someone hurt badly?" Her voice emerged soft but steady, one of the few things the attack hadn't taken from her. 3 years had passed, but sometimes she still woke gasping for air, feeling phantom hands around her throat, afraid so. That new ranch hand of Marshall's, the big fella, name of Ethan Reed, got himself caught between some angry steers and a fence post. Doc says he's tore up something fierce. Parker ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair, concern etching lines around his eyes. Good man, that Reed. Came through about 6 months back. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's fair and works harder than any 2 men. Shame about the accident. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share what city you're watching from in the comments. Something in the sheriff's description caught Anna's attention. She'd glimpsed Reed only from a distance, a mountain of a man, with shoulders broad as an axe handle, who somehow managed to move with unexpected grace around the mercantile when he came to town for supplies. He never lingered to chat like the other cowhands, never darkened the saloon doors, and something in his careful movements, the way his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, struck a chord of recognition within her. "I'll hurry then," she said, already turning toward the path that would lead to Doc Wilson's surgery at the edge of town. The doctor's small wooden building sat alone against the backdrop of rolling hills, offering what privacy could be had in a town where everyone knew everyone's business by sundown. Hannah entered through the back door as was her custom, avoiding the small waiting area where prying eyes might linger. The familiar smells of carbolic acid and medicinal whiskey greeted her, along with Doc's frustrated muttering from behind the examination room's closed door. Hannah rapped softly. "It's Hannah, Doc. I've brought the supplies." The door swung open to reveal the elderly physician, his spectacles perched low on his nose, and his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms spotted with age, but still strong enough to set broken bones and stitch wounds. "Thank the Lord. Come in, girl. This one's going to need your steady hands." He stepped aside, revealing the massive form lying on the examination table, and Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Ethan Reed was even larger up close, his frame barely contained by the narrow table. Blood seeped through hastily applied bandages across his chest and right arm, but it was his face that captured Hannah's attention. Strong-jawed and handsome, despite the pain etched across his features. with eyes the deep blue of mountain lakes, that now fixed upon her with startling intensity. And scars, a network of old white lines crossing his left cheek and disappearing into his hairline, telling a story of violence survived. Hannah instinctively raised a hand to her own collar before forcing it back down to her side. "Ma'am," he managed, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Despite his obvious pain, he attempted to sit up straighter, as though unwilling to appear weak before a lady. The movement caused him to wince, a flash of agony crossing his features before being ruthlessly suppressed. "Don't you ma'am me while you're bleeding all over my table," Doc Wilson grumbled, pushing him gently but firmly back down. "Miss Miller here is my assistant, and she's seen men in worse states than you, so lie still." He turned to Hannah. 3 broken ribs for certain, a nasty gash across the chest that'll need stitching, and that arm's been laid open to the muscle. "I'll handle the ribs if you'll see to the stitching." Hannah nodded, already moving to prepare needle and thread, grateful for the familiar routine that allowed her to focus on something other than those piercing blue eyes. She rolled up her sleeves only to the elbows, high enough to work efficiently, but not so high as to reveal the worst of her scars, and set to cleaning the wounds with practiced efficiency. As she leaned over to examine the gash on his chest, she became acutely aware of Reed's gaze following her movements, lingering on the thin white line visible at her throat. Not with the usual morbid curiosity she'd grown accustomed to, but with something like recognition. "Understanding. Had a run-in with a knife once myself," he said quietly, his words meant for her ears alone as Doc busied himself preparing bandages. "Fella in Wyoming thought I'd cheated him at cards." A simple statement, offered without explanation or pity, just an acknowledgement that left Hannah momentarily startled into stillness. "Mine weren't from cards," she replied, before she could stop herself. The first time she'd made even oblique reference to her scars to anyone besides Doc Wilson. Something about the man's direct gaze made lies seem pointless. She turned away quickly, focusing intently on threading the needle, her cheeks burning. "Never figured they were," Reed said, then fell silent as Hannah began the painstaking work of closing the gash across his chest. His only reaction to the needle piercing his skin was a slight tightening around his eyes, his breathing carefully controlled. Hannah worked with quiet efficiency, her small hands moving with the precision that had made Doc Wilson declare her a natural healer. The silence between them grew oddly comfortable, broken only by occasional directions from the doctor as he bound Reed's ribs. It took nearly an hour to clean and close all the cowboy's wounds. By the time Hannah tied off the last stitch on his arm, the sun had set, casting the small surgery into shadows broken only by the warm glow of oil lamps. Doc Wilson stretched, his old joints cracking audibly. "That'll do, I think. You're lucky, Reed. Another inch, and those horns would have found something vital." He peered at the cowboy over his spectacles. "You can't ride back to the Marshall place tonight. I'd offer you the examination table, but he can stay at my place," Hannah said, surprising herself as much as the 2 men who turned to stare at her. She hurried on before her courage failed. "I mean, I have a spare room above the apothecary shop. Doc arranged it when I came to town. It's small, but it would be more comfortable than this table, and I can check his bandages in the morning." She kept her eyes on her work, carefully packing away the remaining bandages and medicines. Doc Wilson raised his eyebrows, but nodded slowly. "That makes good sense, actually. I've got the Cooper baby due any day now, and I should stay close to their farm tonight." He glanced between Hannah and the cowboy. "If you're both agreeable, that is." Reed's eyes never left Hannah's face. Only if it's no trouble to the lady, he said formally, though something in his gaze suggested he understood exactly how momentous an offer this was from someone who barely spoke to strangers. It's no trouble, Hannah replied softly, finally meeting his eyes directly. I have nightmares anyway. Might as well be useful if I'm going to be awake. The small building that housed Copper Creek's apothecary shop had stood empty for nearly a year before Doc Wilson suggested Hannah might put her knowledge of herbs and medicines to use for the town. The living quarters above proved just large enough for a woman alone, with a small sitting room, a bedroom, and a second tiny room that Hannah had used mainly for storage until now. As she helped Reed navigate the narrow stairs, his massive frame dwarfing the stairwell, she found herself simultaneously questioning her sanity and feeling more certain of this decision than anything in recent memory. It's not much, she apologized as they reached the landing, Reed moving slowly to accommodate his bandaged ribs. But it's clean. She led him to the small room where she'd hastily cleared space and laid out fresh linens on the narrow bed, while Doc had given Reed final instructions downstairs. It's a palace compared to some places I've laid my head, Reed assured her, easing himself carefully onto the bed's edge. In the warm light of the single lamp, his scars stood out in stark relief against his tanned skin, telling tales of a life lived hard. He made no move to hide them, wearing them with a matter-of-factness that Hannah found herself envying. Thank you, Miss Miller. Your kindness won't be forgotten. Hannah lingered in the doorway, suddenly unsure what to do with her hands or where to look. Hannah, she corrected quietly. My name is Hannah. It felt important somehow that he use her given name, this scarred stranger who looked at her damaged skin without flinching. Hannah, he repeated, her name emerging like something precious in his deep voice. I'm Ethan, and I meant what I said. I'm in your debt. There's no debt between people who've survived, she replied, the words emerging before she could consider them. Their eyes met in shared understanding before Hannah stepped back. Try to rest. I'll bring you some willow bark tea for the pain shortly. She closed the door softly behind her, leaning against it for a moment as her heart hammered in her chest. What had possessed her to bring a stranger, a man, into her sanctuary? Yet somehow, looking into Ethan Reed's eyes, she'd recognized something familiar, a wariness that matched her own. The scars on his face might have been put there by a card player's knife, but Hannah would wager her small savings that there were other, deeper wounds that couldn't be seen. Over the next 3 days, a quiet routine developed. Hannah tended to Ethan's wounds, morning and evening, checking for signs of infection and changing bandages with professional detachment, at least outwardly. Each time her fingers brushed his skin, a jolt of awareness shot through her that had nothing to do with her medical training. During the days, she worked in the shop below, mixing tinctures and filling the townspeople's orders for headache powders and cough syrups. In the evenings, they shared simple meals at her small table, their conversation gradually moving from polite inquiries about the weather to more personal revelations. On the third night, as Hannah cleared away the remains of a rabbit stew, Ethan finally asked the question she'd been both dreading and anticipating. How did it happen? Your scars. His voice held no pity, only a genuine desire to understand. Hannah's hands stilled on the dishes. For 3 years, she deflected such questions or simply walked away. But something about the man, watching her with those steady blue eyes, made her want to unburden herself, to share the weight she'd carried alone for so long. Slowly, she sank back into her chair. I was traveling west with my husband, Daniel. We'd been married just 6 months when he decided California held better prospects than Pennsylvania. Her voice remained steady, though her fingers twisted in her apron. We joined a small wagon train. Nothing grand, just 3 families and a couple of single men looking for gold or adventure. Ethan remained silent, giving her space to continue at her own pace. Hannah drew a deep breath. We were 2 months into the journey when they attacked. Not Indians, white men, deserters from the army, turned bandits. They came at night, killed the men first. The clinical detachment of her voice belied the horror of the memory. My husband died trying to protect me. The leader, he had a knife, said he liked to mark pretty things so no one else would want them. Her hand unconsciously rose to her throat, tracing the scar that ran from ear to collarbone. He started here. Hannah, Ethan breathed, her name a prayer and a curse combined. His massive hands clenched on the table, knuckles white. There were 5 of them. They took turns. Hannah's gaze turned distant, seeing not her small kitchen, but that terrible night under cold stars. When they finished, they used the knife. Arms, legs, stomach, anywhere that would show if I wore anything but the most concealing clothes. They left me for dead beside Daniel. A bitter smile twisted her lips. But I didn't die. A Shoshone hunting party found me the next morning. Their medicine woman kept me alive somehow, though I don't remember much of those first weeks. Eventually, they brought me to the nearest settlement where Doc Wilson was visiting. He brought me here when I was strong enough to travel. Ethan reached across the table slowly, telegraphing his movement, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, his calloused fingers gently covered hers. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," he said simply. Hannah gave a short, humorless laugh. "I'm not strong. I'm hiding. In high collars and long sleeves, in a town where everyone whispers, but no one asks directly. Strong would be not caring what they see or think." "That's horseshit," Ethan replied, the crude language startling a genuine laugh from Hannah. "Begging your pardon, but it is. Surviving at all was strength. Building a new life was strength. And protecting yourself from gawkers and gossips isn't weakness. It's self-preservation." His thumb moved in small circles against the back of her hand. "I know something about it." "Your face?" Hannah asked softly. He nodded. "That's just the beginning. Cards in Wyoming was the truth, but not the whole truth." With his free hand, he began unbuttoning his shirt. Hannah's eyes widened, but before she could speak, he had pulled the fabric aside to reveal his torso. Between the fresh bandages, a tapestry of old scars covered his chest and abdomen, some from knives, others clearly from bullets, and across his left side, a pattern of deliberate, small, circular burns. "Confederate prison camp, last year of the war," he explained quietly. "I was a Union scout, captured behind enemy lines. The commandant had creative ideas about interrogation." His eyes held Hannah's, unflinching. "I wore a beard for years after. Kept my shirt on even in summer. Couldn't stand the staring, the questions. Then one day in Dodge City, I realized I was letting them win, the men who did this. They were probably dead, but I was still their prisoner." Hannah stared at the map of suffering etched into his skin, her healer's fingers itching to trace each scar, to somehow erase the pain they represented. "How did you stop caring what others thought?" Ethan rebuttoned his shirt slowly. "Never said I stopped caring. Just decided my comfort mattered less than my freedom." Still don't like the stairs, but I won't melt from them either. His eyes softened as they held hers. But I understand why you hide yours. A man with scars is seen as tough, dangerous even. A woman, he trailed off, not needing to complete the thought. Damaged, Hannah finished for him. Ruined. No, Ethan shook his head firmly. Never that. Changed, perhaps. Marked by life. But those marks tell a story of survival, not ruin. They sat in silence for several moments, his large hands still covering her smaller one, a connection neither seemed willing to break. Finally, Hannah spoke again. Will you tell me about the war? The real parts, not the newspaper glory? And so he did. As the night deepened around them, Ethan spoke of things he rarely shared. The terror of scout missions behind enemy lines, the brothers in arms lost to bullets and disease, the dehumanizing months in the prison camp where he'd earned his scars. Hannah listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions, but mostly giving him the same space to unburden himself that he had offered her. When the mantel clock chimed midnight, they were still talking, their chairs drawn closer, their shared histories creating a bridge between them. Over the following week, as Ethan's wounds healed and his strength returned, the connection between them deepened. Hannah found herself sharing small, daily victories, standing her ground when Mrs. Abernathy probed too deeply about her past, wearing a slightly lower collar despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. Ethan spoke of his own slow journey toward making peace with his past, of nightmares that still sometimes woke him shouting, of his determination to build something meaningful from the ashes of war. Their conversations never felt like confessions or therapy, just the natural exchange between two people who recognized themselves in each other. Hannah began to realize that in Ethan's presence, she felt truly seen for the first time since the attack. Not as a victim or an object of pity, but as a whole woman with wounds that were just one part of her story. On the 10th day, Doc Wilson pronounced Ethan healed enough to return to work at the Marshall Ranch. Light duties only for another week, the doctor instructed sternly. And come back if there's any sign of infection or if those ribs give you trouble. Hannah felt an irrational surge of disappointment. She'd known this day would come, had reminded herself repeatedly not to become too accustomed to Ethan's presence in her small home. Yet the thought of returning to her solitary existence left her cold. She busied herself gathering supplies in the apothecary while the men spoke, focusing intently on sorting dried herbs to avoid meeting Ethan's eyes when he came to find her. "So, I'll be heading back to the Marshall place," he said from the doorway, his massive frame nearly filling it. "Seems I've outstayed my welcome with the good doctor." Hannah nodded, still not looking up. "That's good news. You've healed well." Her hands moved automatically, measuring and mixing a headache powder that no one had ordered. Ethan stepped into the room, closing the distance between them. Hannah, just her name spoken softly, but with enough command that she finally raised her eyes to his. "Thank you for everything." "It was nothing," she replied automatically. "Just doing what needed doing." We both know that's not true. His blue eyes held hers steadily. "You let me into your home, your life. You trusted me with your story." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I'd like to see you again, not as your patient, but as a man calls on a woman he admires." Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. "I don't know if that's wise," she whispered, though everything in her yearned to say yes. "You know what happened to me, what I look like beneath these clothes." Her cheeks flushed at the inadvertent intimacy of the statement, but she pressed on. I'm not the kind of whole, unscarred woman a man like you should court. Something flashed in Ethan's eyes, not pity, but a fierce protectiveness that stole Hannah's breath. May I speak plainly, Miss Miller? The formality, after days of using her given name, made her blink. But she nodded. I've known my share of so-called whole, unscarred women. Met plenty on cattle drives and in towns across the territory. Never felt for any of them what I feel when you walk into a room. He took a step closer, moving with deliberate care, giving her space to retreat if she wished. I dream about your smile, the way your eyes light up when you talk about healing, your strength that you don't even see. Another step. I don't give a damn about your scars, except that they're part of what made you who you are today, the woman I can't stop thinking about. Hannah stood frozen, her carefully constructed walls crumbling beneath the sincerity in his voice. It's not just the appearance, she said softly. What they did to me? I don't know if I can ever be with a man again. Not in that way. The admission cost her, but she forced herself to continue. It wouldn't be fair to you, to accept your attentions knowing I might never offer more than companionship. Ethan's expression softened. Hannah Miller, I'm not some green boy ruled by base desires. I'm asking to call on you, to share meals and conversation, to walk with you on summer evenings, to earn your trust day by day. His voice dropped lower. And if that's all that ever comes of it, I'd count myself fortunate to have that much of you. A tear slipped down Hannah's cheek before she could stop it. And if the town talks? If they say you could do better than damaged goods? In 2 strides, Ethan closed the remaining distance between them. His large hands came up to frame her face with exquisite gentleness. His touch so light she could barely feel it against her skin. Then I'd tell them that every scar you bear is a testament to your courage, that you survived hell and came out the other side not just alive, but kind, compassionate, and strong enough to rebuild your life. His thumb brushed away her tear. I'd tell them that any man would be blessed to stand beside a woman of such quality, and that I thank God daily that I was fortunate enough to have a run-in with those ornery steers. Hannah gave a watery laugh at that, her hands hesitantly coming up to rest against his chest. You have a silver tongue for a cowboy, Ethan Reed. Only speaking truth as I see it, ma'am, he replied, a smile warming his eyes. So what do you say? May I call on you properly, starting with dinner at the hotel restaurant tomorrow evening? The prospect of appearing in public, seated across from this man, where everyone could see and speculate, sent a flutter of anxiety through Hannah's chest. But looking up into Ethan's steady gaze, she found her fear outweighed by something stronger, the desire to stop hiding, to claim some piece of happiness despite what had been taken from her. Yes, she whispered, I'd like that. The smile that broke across Ethan's face was like sunrise after the longest night, transforming his rugged features into something breathtaking. Slowly, telegraphing his intentions, he bent down until his lips brushed her forehead in the lightest of kisses. Until tomorrow, then, Hannah Miller. Word spread quickly through Copper Creek that the quiet apothecary woman and Marshall's massive ranch hand were keeping company. Hannah felt the stares intensify during her daily errands, heard the whispers cut off abruptly when she entered the general store. But alongside the discomfort came a strange new feeling, a growing indifference to others' opinions that felt like liberation. Ethan walked beside her with quiet pride, his hand always ready at her elbow, his eyes challenging anyone who dared stare too long or whisper too loudly. Their courtship progressed with careful patience on both sides. Ethan never pushed for more than Hannah was ready to give, content with evening walks and shared meals, with conversations that ranged from childhood memories to dreams of the future. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence on the bench outside her shop, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. On those evenings, Hannah would occasionally let her gloved hand rest in his larger one, marveling at how safe she felt with this man who had survived his own private war. The first time he kissed her properly, a gentle meeting of lips beneath the cottonwood tree by the creek, Hannah surprised herself by not flinching away. Instead, she found herself leaning into his strength, her hands coming up to rest against the solid wall of his chest, as something long dormant fluttered to life within her. Ethan kept the kiss brief and sweet, pulling back to search her eyes for any sign of distress or regret. Finding none, he smiled that sunrise smile that never failed to warm her from within. "Been wanting to do that since about 5 minutes after you started stitching me up," he confessed, his voice rougher than usual. Hannah laughed, the sound still rare enough to be precious. "Liar! You were in too much pain to think of kissing anyone." "You'd be surprised what a man can think about even with broken ribs," he countered, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with surprising tenderness for such large hands. "You've got a way about you, Hannah Miller, a quiet strength that draws a person in." As summer ripened toward autumn, their relationship deepened, built on shared understanding and growing trust. Hannah began to speak more freely in town, to meet the curious gazes of townsfolk with a steady gaze of her own. She still wore high collars and long sleeves, but the desperate need to hide had lessened. Ethan's matter-of-fact acceptance of both her visible scars and the hidden damage to her spirit worked a kind of healing that Doc Wilson's medicines never could. On a golden September evening nearly 3 months after Ethan's injury had brought them together, Hannah invited him to dinner at her apartment above the shop. She'd spent the day preparing his favorite foods, her mind occupied with a decision that had been forming slowly over weeks of gentle courtship. When Ethan arrived, freshly shaved and wearing his good shirt, a small bunch of prairie wildflowers in his massive hand, Hannah felt the last of her doubts melt away. They ate by lamplight, the conversation flowing easily between them as it always did. When the meal was finished, Hannah gathered her courage and rose from the table. Ethan watched her curiously as she moved to stand before him, her eyes holding a new resolve he hadn't seen before. "Ethan," she began, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart, "these past months with you have given me back something I thought was lost forever. Not just hope or happiness, though you've brought both, but belief in myself, in my right to live fully, despite what was done to me." She took a deep breath, her fingers moving to the top button of her high collar. "I want to show you something, all of me." Ethan's eyes widened in understanding. "Hannah, you don't have to." "I know," she interrupted gently. "That's why I can." Her fingers continued their work, unfastening one button after another until her collar lay open, revealing the network of thin white scars that crisscrossed her throat and disappeared beneath the fabric of her bodice. With hands that trembled only slightly, she continued, removing her outer bodice until she stood before him in her thin chemise, arms bare. There was no disgust in his gaze, no pity, only profound respect and something deeper. Something that made her feel truly beautiful for the first time since the attack. "You are the bravest person I've ever known," he said softly, making no move to touch her without invitation. "Thank you for trusting me with this." Hannah stepped forward until she stood between his knees, taking his large hands and placing them gently on her waist. "I trust you with more than my scars, Ethan Reed. I trust you with my heart, if you want it." A tremor ran through his powerful frame. "Are you sure, Hannah? There's no rush, no need." She silenced him by placing her fingers against his lips. "I've spent 3 years letting dead men decide what I could feel, where I could go, how much of life I was allowed to reclaim." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "No more. I choose this. I choose you. Not because I've forgotten what happened, but because I refuse to let it define the rest of my life." Ethan rose slowly to his feet, towering over her small frame, but somehow making her feel not diminished, but sheltered. With infinite care, he bent to place a kiss against the scar that ran along her collarbone. "Beautiful," he murmured against her skin. His lips moved to another mark on her shoulder. "Courageous." To her wrist, where a particularly vicious slash had nearly taken her hand. "Strong." Tears flowed freely down Hannah's cheeks now as Ethan continued his gentle pilgrimage across her damaged skin. His lips blessing each scar with reverence, his whispered words transforming marks of violence into badges of survival. When he had kissed every visible scar, he straightened to look into her eyes, his own shining with moisture. "These are your treasures, Hannah. Proof of a spirit that couldn't be broken. And if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my days reminding you of that truth." Hannah reached up to trace the scars on his own face, marveling at how they enhanced rather than diminished the strength of his features. "I'll have you, Ethan Reed. Every scarred, beautiful inch of you." His arms encircled her then, gentle despite their strength, pulling her against the solid warmth of his chest. Against her ear, his deep voice rumbled, "And I'll have you, Hannah Miller, every scarred, beautiful inch of you, for as long as you'll allow." As the autumn light faded into dusk outside her window, Hannah stood wrapped in Ethan's embrace, their shared scars pressed together like a promise. For the first time in 3 years, she felt not broken but whole, not in spite of her scars, but because she had finally found someone who saw them as they truly were. Not marks of shame, but constellations mapping a survivor's courage. 3 months later, Hannah Miller became Hannah Reed in a small ceremony in Doc Wilson's parlor. She wore a dress with a lower neckline than she'd dared in years, her most visible scar on display, not as a badge of shame, but as part of her history. Ethan stood tall beside her, his scarred face alight with pride and joy as they spoke their vows before the small gathering of townspeople who had come to respect the quiet strength they recognized in both bride and groom. As Ethan swept her into a kiss that sealed their union, whispers rippled through the assembled guests, not of pity or scandal, but of admiration for two souls who had found in each other's brokenness a perfect kind of wholeness. That night, as they lay entwined in the darkness of their new home, a small cabin Ethan had built on land of their own at the edge of town, Hannah traced the scars across her husband's broad chest, no longer afraid of either giving or receiving such intimate touch. "Do you ever wish they weren't there?" she asked softly. "Your scars?" Ethan's hand moved to cover hers, pressing her palm flat against his heart. "Not anymore," he answered thoughtfully. They led me to you. How could I regret the path that brought me home? Hannah settled her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. Outside their window, the vast western sky spread star-studded and limitless, much like the future stretching before them. A future where scars were not endings, but beginnings. Not wounds, but treasures, marking the places where they had been broken and made stronger in the healing. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.